Annie, and then Brian Ross, you're on deck.
Hi everyone, I'm Annie Potworth and I am a sustainability specialist with the City of St. Louis Park. And similar to Lauren, as we've been spending more time inside cooking, I've been trying to perfect my homemade vinaigrette as well. So if anyone's interested, I do vinegar, balsamic vinegar, olive oil, shallots, Dijon, some garlic and honey all in there. So it's been really good.
That sounds super good. So Brian Ross, then Mike Palermo.
Okay, I'm Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute, and I was thinking of doing some smart aleck response about, people eat salad, but no, I actually do eat salad, and I used to always go with the creamy whatever, but I have moved and started to appreciate the kind of balsamic vinaigrette.
Nice. So Mike, then Chris.
I guess I would go with Italian, and you kind of stole my thunder, Rebecca, that we also have the Olive Garden Italian dressing in our house right now, and I think we'll probably keep getting that.
Awesome. So Chris, and then Dave Wanberg.
Chris Acuna, and I'm with the Great Plains Institute, and I'm not a huge salad dressing person, but I do really like kind of like a peanut-based dressing to go with.
All right, Dave, then Kelly.
I'm Dave Wanberg with the City of Faribault, and I actually I prefer not having salad dressing at all, but if I do put anything on, it'll just be, squeezed lemon, something like that.
All right, Dave, or Kelly, then Jacqueline.
Hi, Kelly Perrine with the City of Lakeville, and I make kind of all my salad dressings at home too, but Chris reminded me of one of my favorite ones. It's like a peanut butter with soy sauce, honey, and vinegar, and I love that one so much. I could eat it with a spoon. It's bad.
Kind of defeats the purpose of the salad.
Exactly.
So Jacqueline, and then Drew.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Kramer. I'm an associate planner with the City of St. Louis Park. And speaking of defeating the purpose of eating a salad, I would say my favorite dressing is blue cheese. The chunkier the better, preferably dipping celery while eating hot wings. It's not even a salad, but there you go.
Sounds good. Drew, and then Story.
Drew Larson, Rochester Public Utilities, and I'm going to have to echo that. Cheese. It's delicious. The stinkier, the better. Good stuff.
All right, Story, then Allie.
Yeah, I'm Story. I am the Green Corps member with the City of Golden Valley, and I love Annie's, who makes the mac and cheese, does a really good shiitake sesame dressing.
I've had it. It's good.
Yeah.
Allie, then Caitlin.
This is Allie. I'm with the City of Inver Grove, excuse me, the City of Inver Grove Heights, and I'm all about the homemade dressings. I think we should have a little recipe sharing thing going on. I don't have one in particular, but they're really cheap, so everyone should start making their own dressings.
It's true. I make a lot of my own. It is pretty easy to do. Caitlin, then Jen McLaughlin, although she's still connecting.
Hi, this is Caitlin Bachland with Great Plains Institute. I love a good Caesar salad, so I'll have to go with Caesar dressing.
So Jen, I'll go to you next, because I just saw that you joined with your audio. We're doing, you can see name, organization, and preferred salad dressing. So S. Strain, I can't remember what your first name is, sorry.
That's all right. My name is Sarah Strain, and I'm one of the planners with the City of Eden Prairie.
Okay.
And I'm going to echo the Caesar salad.
Awesome. All right, Jen, you're up.
All right, Jen McLaughlin, City of Woodbury. Sorry, my camera is not working for some reason. And I got my audio to work though, but my favorite dressings like a Thai peanut, anything with like spice and that sort of thing.
So it sounds like Italian, peanutty, kind of Asian, some balsamic vinaigrette. There's a lot of variety, and then, you know, of course, the blue cheeses. The old school is the blue cheeses from the Thousand Islands. All right, I think I got everyone that's on. So we will go ahead, and I'm just going to turn it over to my colleague, Brian, who's going to do, here's the agenda. We're going to kind of overview some specific zoning and ordinances for electric vehicles. Then we'll have, we're really glad to have Jacqueline with us for the city testimonial to talk about some of their work. And then a city panel, where a couple of cities are going to talk about some of their work that they're working on. And then, you know, look at kind of talk again about the self-assessment and see how that went for folks. So Brian, go ahead and take over.
Okay, make sure I'm not muted in the various places that I sometimes end up being muted. Yeah, so this workshop is really focusing on one aspect of EV readiness that cities need to consider, which is the regulation category of actions. This is the place where cities have the most influence probably over the private sector. Between this and education efforts or incentives that can be done to influence the private sector, these are the two places where the biggest impacts are, but sometimes the most difficult to administer or the most politically challenging do lie. So it's very important to do and to think about how you're going to get to it, but it's a critical, important category. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. So this is, and most of you have seen this, we've been talking about it, is kind of our matrix of EV readiness. The categories, we have 6 categories across the top, which are, you know, very broadly defined about things that you need to think about for EV readiness. And then we have kind of some best practices down in the columns for each one of those categories. We have structured this kind of concept of EV readiness and the EV Ready program, the certification program that we would like to have put in place here if we can get some funding to do it. Similar to the Green Step Cities program, as well as the SolSmart National Certification Program for Solar Ready Communities, where there are these categories and then kind of best practices, and then underneath each one of these best practices is actions. And in the certification process, kind of similar to the SolSmart process, those of you who are involved in that, there are points assigned to different action categories. In the Green Step Cities program, of course, with actions, you just kind of check the box and it's a yes or no. There are a few that are mandatory and a few that are optional. But in the certification process, there would actually be different point values assigned to the different levels of difficulty or importance for the actions underneath these best practices. And today we are going to be focusing on that regulation, that orange category, and the best practices associated with that, and what cities can do and why it's important for them to move ahead with that. Okay, next slide. So here are the 5 best practices associated with that regulation category. And I will say that there's some evolution of these best practices going along. So this is something that as we kind of get further down the road on our EV readiness program or certification effort, they may evolve a little bit. But the 5 best practices are, I'm going to go down each one of them, enabling EVs and EV chargers, or as we abbreviated EVSE, in land use regulations to make sure that they're explicitly addressed in your land use regulations. Second is to actually incorporate EV and EVSE in your parking standards. And this is primarily an EVSE issue where your parking standards will require EV charging equipment or EV ready installations for different kinds of land uses or in different kinds of circumstances. The third best practice is incorporating EVs and EVSE, again, primarily the charging equipment in your building code. Now in Minnesota, you as a city code, but we are designing this kind of in recognition of the fact that we may have an option to do that at some point in the future for cities here in Minnesota, and also a program that we may be doing outside of Minnesota where in some states, cities do have the option of looking at the building code as a tool for moving ahead. The fourth best practice is around streamlining permitting. And there's several different aspects to this, but cities administer permits of a variety of types. And there's ways to incorporate and streamline that process to make sure that charging equipment in particular is being addressed in a way that's straightforward and transparent to people who want to put them into their buildings or their parking facilities, as well as a few other places, as I'm going to describe, like public right-of-ways. And then finally, the fifth best practice is deploying EVSE in multifamily housing. We actually had this wrapped into one of the earlier ones, but we want to pull it out because it's a particularly an equity issue to make sure that people who live in multifamily buildings actually can participate in the benefits of EV and participate in the EV revolution that we're going to be looking at here in the very near future. Next slide. So what I wanted to do is go through each one of these to give you some examples of the kind of actions that we would look at underneath each one of these best practices, and to provide you with an example of actual ordinance language or permit language that would make sense that people have actually adopted in various cities. And I will say ahead of time that a lot of really good examples that I was going to use are in St. Louis Park. But since Jacqueline is going to give us a detailed description of that in her presentation, I think I've only used them as an example once. So so there's going to be a lot of great stuff for each one of these points that Jacqueline will talk about for St. Louis Park. But the first best practice is enabling EVs and EV charging equipment in your land use regulations. And what this really means is making sure that the code is not creating inadvertent barriers. And the three kind of action examples that we're using for this particular best practice are making sure that your code, your zoning code, permits level 2 chargers as an accessory use to parking lots in all zoning districts. It's something that probably your code officials and your zoning officials would do anyway, but to make it clear and transparent, to explicitly put it into your code. Similarly, you need to think about this perhaps separately, level 3 or the direct DCFC, direct current fast charging chargers, making sure that they're enabled either for in selected districts or for specific land uses, because it is a little bit more challenging kind of land use, and there are some potential circulation patterns in terms of your traffic that you need to take into consideration for this kind of a charger. And then the third one is for that DCFC is to actually develop some of those standards, perhaps even some design and circulation standards for when it is a public location that is going to be used to do fast charging. Okay, go to the next slide. An example of language that has been adopted by actual cities on this issue is, you can see the city of Des Moines has a fairly simple statement in their code that just says level 1, 2, and 3 electric vehicle charging stations are allowed in all zoning designations. So they basically just with that simple one sentence have enabled it clearly and made it obvious that the code allows these as a permitted use and as a accessory use in this case in all zoning districts. The city of Chelan, Washington, in contrast, specifically allowed as permitted uses level 1 and level 2 chargers, but said level 3 chargers are a permitted use in particular districts, recognizing that it's a slightly different land use with some slightly different consequences, and they did not want to enable it as a permitted use across all the districts and have people putting up a level 3 charger someplace in a residential district and having a circle of, kind of like a gas station where people would be coming to charge their vehicles. So that's kind of two different applications, two different ways that it's done. It's a fairly simple thing to do, but it is an important thing and makes a difference. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the second best practice is incorporating EVs and EV charging equipment in your parking standards. And this is something that almost all cities can do. And St. Louis Park is going to give us some great examples of this. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but we have 5 different types of ways that we've identified in terms of actions that you can take in your code and in your ordinances in order to achieve this particular best practice. And that's requiring charging equipment or EVSE ready, kind of make ready in different kinds of land uses, for instance, in employment centers or in retail centers at different thresholds. You need to identify in your code how EV stalls, charging stalls fit within your parking minimum or maximums. If you're limiting a charging station or a parking stall to only EVs, does it help you meet your parking minimums? What about if you have a parking maximum? Does it count against your parking maximum? We would say that you should say that it does count to your minimum and it does not count to your maximum, but it's something you need to make explicit because it's going to come up. You need to protect EV charging access, especially for public locations. You need to pass an ordinance that says it is against the city's law to park in an EV spot unless you're an EV. That is something a lot of cities have done, and there's some good examples of language around that. And then you need to think about how you can or might be able to encourage or incentivize managed charging as part of your parking standards. Okay, go to the next slide. Some examples here, and this is where I did actually use St. Louis Park, and we'll perhaps hear more about this, but they included for non-residential land uses, all new, expanded, or reconstructed parking areas shall provide the electrical capacity necessary to accommodate future hardware installations of level 2 or fast chargers for a minimum of 10% of the required parking spaces. So they're just requiring, in this instance, make ready or EV ready. The Duluth example is out of their Unified Development Code, and it's actually it's not a requirement, but it is they have a certification for sustainable development in their code, and in order to qualify, you have to get a certain number of points. This is one of the ways you can achieve a point, which is you can make sure that a minimum of 2% of your parking places are assigned and reserved for hybrid, electric, or low energy vehicles in the preferred locations near the primary building entrance. And this is something that a standard that kind of comes out of the USGBC LEED Green Building Standards. And most places have gone well beyond the 2% requirement now, but it is something that Duluth has done and is another example of how it's done in the state of Minnesota. Okay, next slide. The third best practice is incorporating EV and EVSE in the building code. And this obviously is something that is not really, you can't do in Minnesota, but I wanted to provide some just examples of how it's been done other places. Obviously, you can require in the building code that all new single family homes have charging. You can require, and we would recommend this, that multifamily buildings are required to have both level 1 and level 2 chargers for a minimum threshold. And we're looking right now as the best practice standard at 20% or more of the parking places. Similarly for commercial parking facilities. And then I threw in a fourth one that is a personal favorite of mine, which is requiring that surface parking facilities, anytime you're going to have a surface parking facility, it needs to be solar ready in addition to EV ready. Because that way you can actually create a lot of synergy and a lot of benefit with synchronized charging with solar, and you can get a dual use out of that wasted space of land space in your surface parking lot. Okay, go to the next slide. You can streamline the permitting, and some of the examples of that include making sure your permit staff have been trained in electric vehicle charging equipment. And that's both building and electric permit staff in particular, because that's something that cities will frequently have it in their portfolio of tools they're using. But even the building code staff, when you start to incorporate the building code requirements, when we have that opportunity to do so. It's good to have a permitting checklist so that people know what is required in order to kind of achieve the electric permits that the city will be processing for this. Also to look, if possible, of working with your utility to integrate the permitting, the electric permitting, with the utilities interconnection requirements, so that you have a single kind of seamless process rather than two disconnected processes. And then finally, something that is also a permitting issue is to develop permits and standards for allowing EV charging in the public right-of-way. And go to the next slide. One of the examples of that is the city of New Orleans, which has a ordinance that they passed because they have very constrained space, and they had a lot of EV owners who didn't have opportunities, garages, because being where they're located, they have a lot fewer garages than someplace like Minnesota, where they're less worried about keeping cars out of the weather. But so they passed an ordinance that effectively, you can see this is a description of the ordinance, and then there's a citation to the actual ordinance down below, that allowed for a permit for people to come in and pull a permit that allowed them to put an EV charger for their personal use in the city's right-of-way, outside of their home where they own the property. And this ordinance details how to establish the permit, the permit requirements, what are the standards of use, how the city is going to enforce it, what the permit fees are, what are penalties for violations of the ordinance, and a variety of other issues. This has enabled people to actually, who don't have a garage, to own their EV and charge it at their home. Okay, go to the next slide. The final best practice is requiring EV chargers in multifamily housing. And we have three kind of specific elements of that in terms of actions that we would have you consider. One is obviously to require charging equipment or charging equipment ready construction in new multifamily parking standards. You can't require it in Minnesota routinely as part of multifamily buildings, but to the extent that you have parking standards associated with those buildings, you can include it in the actual ordinance. You can also look to some other tools that you have for multifamily buildings, such as licensing. Rental properties are frequently licensed. Are there ways that you can incorporate electric vehicle charging incentives in the licensing process, or when people come in and pull their permits for that, or come and get a renewal of their license, such that you can encourage existing rental properties to start to encourage this. And this is a great thing to do in conjunction with your utility if they have an incentive program. And then finally, of course, deploying EVSE in public right-of-ways or other public areas that are near multifamily housing. And this is targeting those areas where you have a lot of renters in order to kind of do your public facilities in terms of kind of how that moves forward. And to do perhaps some public investment in that. Okay, so those are the 5 best practices that we have in that. Oh, yeah, here's an example of the multifamily housing language. City of Chicago has passed a minimum requirement for on-site parking in any multifamily building that has on-site parking has to achieve at least 20% and no less than 1 parking space that is either EV ready or EVSE installed. So, and they actually did this both in their zoning code and in their building code, because they have control over the building code. So this is kind of a combined ordinance that addresses both of those things, but it is language that is similar to zoning code language, so I included it here as an example, in addition to probably what Jacqueline will be talking about. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. I think this is where I'm gonna turn it over, because we have a great example in the city of St. Louis Park, kind of the state leading EV ready example that Jacqueline is going to describe to us, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you say. So turn it over to Jacqueline.
Thank you, Brian. Again, my name is Jacqueline Kramer, and I'm Associate Planner with the City of St. Louis Park. If you don't mind, I've got a short PowerPoint I'll share, so I'm going to bump Rebecca and pull up my slides. Okay. Can everyone see the slide?
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about our EV zoning ordinance in St. Louis Park that was approved a couple of years ago. Developing the ordinance actually took several years, and the formal process started after we had a really strong policy groundwork for it, which made the whole process a lot easier. So in 2018, St. Louis Park City Council adopted a climate action plan that has very ambitious goals for the city, including carbon neutrality or a net zero carbon footprint by 2040. There was a really robust public process as a part of this action plan. You can see here, it was actually led by students and the Environmental and Sustainability Commission. So there was a lot of feedback from the public and residents that informed the plan. One of the goals of the plan is to reduce vehicle emissions in the city by 25%. And then under that, it talks about increasing electric vehicle infrastructure, both at public or city-owned properties and at private properties. So based on that policy guidance, we started the process of including EV charging infrastructure in our zoning ordinance in the parking section. That's the route we chose to go. I know other cities do it differently, but we decided to go with a regulatory framework for that. So this slide just shows kind of the timeline of how it started. Formal research, although we had been researching this for years before, but it actually started in summer 2017. We had multiple study sessions with our planning commission as we drafted the ordinance from summer 2017 to fall 2019. We held the public hearing, the last meeting in December of 2019, and then it was adopted actually in 2020, not 2019. And then the ordinance went into effect in February. We had a couple of overall goals that we kept going back to as we discussed with Planning Commission as we drafted this ordinance. One, of course, was to increase access, especially for multifamily property. I mentioned that was a big concern. It's a lot easier to charge your electric vehicle at home if you have a garage. So what do we do for folks who live in an apartment building? So we were very careful about how we included requirements for multifamily residential. We also had a goal of just increasing visibility of EV in the city. So that kind of tied into where we require EV stations to be placed, just kind of making the city or people who are visiting or living in the city aware that they can charge their electric vehicle cars in the city. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for properties to add EVs, while also making sure that this requirement applies to everyone equally. So we're getting EV charging in multiple locations throughout the city. And then finally, Planning Commission and staff spent a lot of time thinking about how not to overburden smaller parking projects or construction projects with this EV requirement. For example, we get a lot of parking permits or parking projects from like churches and schools. And so we were trying to be very thoughtful about how to get EV infrastructure into those smaller projects without completely blowing the budget, and therefore someone might not be able to do anything. So it was kind of a balance on the smaller scale projects. The only other thing I'll note on the adoption is while we were drafting the ordinance over many months, we also started including EV requirements in our planning development contracts for projects that had discretionary approvals, so like PUDs, and also projects that were asking for financial assistance from the city, like TIF. Planning development contracts are a way to include a variety of requirements that aren't necessarily in the zoning code, but are something that the city wants to see. So we were able to use those projects as test cases to see how our ordinance worked in the real world before we brought the final draft to council. So by the time we went to council, we were able to say, we've already built, so many charging stations in the city, and it worked out fine. So that really helped with the final adoption of the ordinance. So this is just a summary of the different sections in our EV zoning ordinance. One, we included a bunch of new definitions for all the technical terms. And then it's the numbers, the amount of required. Essentially, it's split up between residential and non-residential uses, and then the size of the project. So smaller projects, either a parking lot or a parking structure of under 15 spaces, they don't have to comply with the ordinance, although we do encourage as much as we can. And then 15 to 49 have a first tier of bigger projects of 50 spaces or more have a higher requirement. We focused more on level 1 charging for multifamily residential because we assumed there'd be a lot more overnight parking. And then for non-residential uses, we focused on level 2 charging, the fast charging. Level 1 and level 2 are allowed as an accessory use in all zoning districts throughout the city, and we allowed it in our single family homes. Level 3 or fast charging are allowed in non-residential zoning districts or commercial areas as an accessory use. And then if a zoning district allows motor fuel stations or gas stations, they are also allowed to do fast charging. So that way you have a gas station, you can also have a fast charger at the same location. We did include a reduction to the EV requirements, again, thinking about really small projects, particularly for like nonprofit users. If the cost of installing the required EV is more than 5% of the total construction cost, we'll say we'll drop down the EV requirement to meet that 5% cost threshold. So getting either conduit or some, fewer number of charging stations while allowing the project to proceed forward. Let's see. As far as permitted locations, in addition to which zoning districts allow which stations, we do require that at least one EV station serves an ADA accessible parking spot. We require that the publicly accessible stations be visible and easily accessible. The idea is to get them as close to the front door as possible on the property. We did not require that property owners put up a sign or limit who can park in those spaces. We didn't require that only EV cars could park in EV charging spaces. Ultimately, we were worried about enforcement, and we didn't want city staff having to enforce those rules. Although we don't, people are free to regulate those spots however they wish. We also allow folks to charge for their charging, but we do not require it. And for example, at City Hall, which is the image shown on the slide, we don't charge for charging, at least right now. These next two slides just kind of break down the numbers. Rebecca said that I can share these slides after the presentation, so I won't go into the numbers, but I will say that we require both EV chargers installed at the time of construction and also conduit to allow for expansion of EV charging in the future. So that was another thing that was really important. As the market share of EV cars grows and demand goes up, we want folks to be able to put in chargers without having to, for example, rip up their parking lot, completely reconstruct their parking structure just to get more chargers in. So getting that conduit in on day one was really important. So let's see. What were the results of our ordinance? So between the planning development contracts where we required EV charging even when the ordinance wasn't adopted yet, and projects that have come through after the ordinance was adopted, we've currently got 17 new level 2 charging stations in the city that are a direct result of the ordinance. Under construction, we've got about 22 more in various projects throughout the city. And then proposed projects, projects that are in the approval process or we anticipate applications coming in the next few weeks or months. We'll probably have about 24 more level 2 stations. And then just on the proposed project or the projects that have been approved but haven't started construction yet, we're probably going to have about 300 level 1 charging stations or outlets near parking spaces that would allow for level 1 charging, and about 300 to 400 spaces that will be served by conduit for future stations. And again, those are just spaces that came about because of the ordinance. There's also been properties throughout the city that have added charging stations on their own. So for example, the Target along Highway 100 added fast charging stations. They did have to apply for an electrical permit. And so through our work on the EV ordinance, staff, both in planning and building and energy, were prepared to get that permit approved, and we kind of knew what to look for as far as the technical specifications. But that particular project, they did that on their own. There's a couple other properties throughout the city where they've just added them. And we highlight them when we could, but I can't take credit for those necessarily. So as far as lessons learned, the first thing I thought I wanted you guys to know is the process. Our process it felt very slow at the time because it was several years, lots of conferences and research, but that ended up being okay. It gave time for planning commissioners and staff to become really familiar with these new technical terms and this new technology. And so it gave us plenty of time for everyone to become comfortable with this brand new requirement, so that in the end, the actual public hearing and the approval process was really quick. Everyone was on board. The long process also allowed us to test the requirements in our various developments along the way, again, so that we knew what we were asking people to do was reasonable and possible. I will also say that having that climate action plan as a guiding policy made starting the ordinance, adopting the ordinance a lot easier. So, as is often the case, having policy in place beforehand made implementing it in the zoning code a lot easier and less painful. We found that for the first initial projects we had under the new requirements for the EV ordinance, there was a lot of back and forth with the construction folk, the owners, a little bit of hand-holding and a little bit of, insisting they have to do this new thing. And we got there, and now it's kind of just another cost of doing business in St. Louis Park. It's just another requirement in our zoning code. We require landscaping, we require lighting in our parking lots. Now we require EV. So that has basically, it's been more or less accepted as part of building in St. Louis Park. And then I think the final lesson I'll mention is that we have always assumed we would need to amend our ordinance as the technology changes, as costs change, as demand goes up or down. And so we've kind of baked that into expectations for our planning commission and city council. And we're doing, we'll probably be doing an overall parking code update in the next few months. And I think we'll be tweaking our EV requirements at the same time. And that's expected, and it's a good thing. So that's a brief overview of the city, but I'm happy to go into more detail on the nitty-gritty of the code, or if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That was very informative, and it sounds like St. Louis Park has done a lot to hit the different things that Brian was just mentioning. Okay, if anyone wanted to ask questions of Jacqueline while she's here, maybe we'll give a few moments. Up next, we have a panel of cities with Bloomington and Rochester, and so there will also be a question and answer after that. So you can either ask a few questions now while we have Jacqueline on, or hold your questions until later.
I was hoping to ask a question. Jacqueline, thank you for sharing your experience. In the very beginning of the process back in 2017, when you were just starting out the whole research aspect, was there something that you did that really ended up laying a good groundwork first for stuff that came later on? And then kind of the flip side of that, was there something that you wish that you had done at the very beginning stage of the process that would make something a little bit easier towards the end?
Yeah, great question. So when we started the process, there weren't many other cities that had done this. And so I basically looked at almost every city in the US that had done it, and I looked at their code, and I kind of we started there, and we started constructing our code based on, you know, how ours is formatted, and then based on how theirs is. And then I mean, we attended conferences. We had a lot of, I found some policy documents from other states that had kind of given guidance on what an EV ordinance might look like. And then again, it was just workshopping over and over with Planning Commission over the course of like 18 months. And then we would update City Council as we went. Yeah, I think just giving Planning Commissioners space to talk things out and kind of get their heads around these things was really helpful. I can't think of anything in particular I would have done differently. I mean, now it might be a little, definitely start with other ordinances. It's all about sharing, right? It's not, don't think of it as copying or as a bad thing. It's we're sharing information. So if you can learn a lesson from someone else's ordinance, definitely do that.
Yes, I love that. And that's why we have this meeting today, right? Oh, go ahead, whoever. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Rebecca, this is Brian. I had a quick question for Jacqueline. Speaking of that sharing ordinances, have you been contacted by other cities saying, hey, what'd you guys do? have you been sharing? And who are those people?
I think some of those people are on this call, actually. Like, I see Mike. Hi, Mike. We presented at EV at an ADA conference a while ago, so I'm very excited to see where your city is at. Yeah, I've been contacted by a couple other people in various suburbs, just asking, like, you know, how'd it go? What did you look at? And I am always happy to share whatever resources I can to make the process a little bit easier for folks. And I think there's.
And then, just as a
I was going to say
follow-up,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I think there's a lot of interest throughout the city, especially now that Minneapolis and St. Paul are slowly getting on board. Although I will say, I think St. Louis Park beat them to the punch on this one. So, but I think momentum's just building on EV, public and private sector. So.
Yeah, and have you kind of mentioned there was a little bit of pushback, at least initially. Has that pretty much disappeared? I mean, in terms of the development community?
Yeah, there was a project in particular I was thinking of where they didn't need city council approval for their project. It was just an administrative building permit. And so that, it was just worked out between our building officials, myself, and the property owner, because the ordinance was so new, they weren't really aware of this requirement before they applied for the building permit. So that initial back and forth of informing them of what the new requirement is, and then figuring out where this EV charger would go on their property. You know, we wanted it right by the front door. They wanted it in the back. Mm-hmm. They wanted to shift handicap parking stalls around, which our building official was like, no. But now I think everyone is aware this is a requirement, like any other requirement in our zoning code. So it's not really something we get pushback on.
I'm guessing you want to move on, Rebecca, but I know that I think we've got plenty of time later in the agenda. So I know early on there was some confusion about the numbers of new plugs because of the ordinance. And I was trying to track, and if you could kind of give that number again, kind of how many plugs do you consider as a result of the ordinance in St. Louis Park?
Like how many have been built since the ordinance went into effect? So I ran the numbers this morning. So I think right now, and I only looked at level 2 charging because level 1 charging, that's a little bit harder.
Yeah.
Currently built, active, I think you can go and plug in your car to these spaces. It's 17 new. Under construction, we've got at least 22 level 2 chargers that should come online in the next few months. And then there's at least 12 more level 2 coming for projects that are either in the approval process right now, or I anticipate applications in the next few months. But I think by the end of the year, we'll probably have a lot more. It kind of depends on if we get a big development, you know, like a big multifamily, that's a lot of charging. And then
Awesome.
lots and lots of conduit. Conduit's one of those things where even if it's a little itty bitty project and they don't even meet the requirement to have to put an EV, if they're tearing up their parking lot, I tell them to put in conduit. Do it now.
Yeah.
Work at it later.
Right. And I'll just comment that I really loved how you talked about how that climate action plan basis was really important, because I think the why of why you're doing this for the electeds, the staff, the community, you've got, like, if you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and transportation is one of the highest emitters, like that gives you the you know, kind of the reason for doing this. And so, you know, for cities that have done, or, you know, are doing or looking at energy goals, carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, I think that gives a lot of backbone to doing this kind of thing in your city, because it has such a big impact to meet your goals. So I love that you really pointed that out. I think it's super important. I'll stop now, Rebecca, sorry.
No, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, and we can get started on our panel. Today we have with us from Bloomington, Mike Palmero, and from Rochester, Lauren Jensen. So first up, Mike, I think you're first in my lineup of PowerPoints. Sure. We're going to ask the cities to briefly describe what they have done, and then we have some questions for them that we've pre-prepared. And finally, then there'll be a time where participants can ask questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll just kind of briefly go through some of unique differences that we have from St. Louis Park. So we followed, it really helped to follow St. Louis Park. They were much further along in their process, and we were able to kind of build off their research and say, look, there's a local example. I think that's always helpful to have that local example, because when you're talking about East Coast, West Coast, people roll their eyes, and we're the Midwest. So I think that was really helpful, and that's acted as a starting point. But we brought that kind of EV readiness with the conduit to our planning commission, and they weren't super excited about that. They weren't ready for that. So I think there's, like Jacqueline said, there's this discussion that has to happen for them to start to feel comfortable, and it's an iterative process. So we really wanted to make sure to just at least get some standards, because up until we started doing this, it was just ignored. It was silent in our code that there are EV stations out there, and it wasn't really sure how they fit in. So the first thing we did was to make sure that was permitted accessory use in all zoning districts. And then we kind of distinguish between what's an accessory use versus like a fueling station, like a level 3 charging fueling station. We wanted to make sure that those are treated just like our gas stations, and, you know, that has that circulation impact and things like that. So we kind of created those two distinctions. Then we also made sure that it would not hurt you on your required parking. So you can have up to 5% of your required parking be for EV charging. You can go above and beyond that, but we would say that it has to be non-proprietary charger. So it can't be like a Tesla supercharger. It has to be one of those non-proprietary. And then we would require that it be open to all spaces. You don't necessarily have to sign for that, but you know, we haven't been to this point yet where someone's meeting that 5%. So we might, you know, this might change in the future. Then we also added just some general standards for single family homes. Just to make sure that people know that you can do this. And if you're going to do an outdoor charger, it's got to be outdoor rated. And then we also put in a distinction on there that you can't sell your charging at your house. So we did have someone provide testimony at Planning Commission that that's a thing that happens, that people put a credit card charger. And you know, we wanted to kind of keep it non-commercial in that residential, single family residential zone. And then we also added a requirement for multifamily construction. So new multifamily is required to have a level 2 charger for every 50 units. So that starts with the first 50 units. So you'll always be required to have at least one. And this really kind of came out of discussion with our Sustainability Commission. This was a unique process for us where Sustainability Commission, which is newer in Bloomington, a few years now, but they really had some opinions on this, as they should be in the Sustainability Commission. But then you have the Planning Commission that this falls under, and the zoning code falls under their purview. So we kind of had two recommending bodies with kind of different ideas that were going to council. So this was an interesting kind of discussion between what level of requirements that we should have. And the multifamily really became a nice middle ground, because we wanted to, the Sustainability Commission really wanted to require for single family homes have at least the panel space for that. Planning Commission wasn't comfortable going that far with the ordinance. And to be honest, we only get a handful of single family homes a year, so it wasn't going to be super impactful anyway. We saw this as being the most impactful and most driven for equity, being that a lot of our multifamily has affordable housing unit component policy that requires affordability. So this also became a discussion on, does this hurt affordable housing development, or how does this relate to that? Because now it's an added expense. But it's very minimal in new construction to add a charger. And we saw in the long run, EV vehicles, and not even the long run, in a few years here, is the cheaper option. So if we're talking about affordable transportation, we want to make sure to have that access that is soon going to be the cheaper option for car ownership. So it was an interesting discussion that we had, that we wanted to look for and make sure that we had the right numbers to show Planning Commission and City Council that this is not going to be negatively impacted, it's actually going to be positive. And to be honest, we've had several multifamily, all affordable, and there's been no pushback on it. It's just, like Jacqueline said, it's just part of the code now. It's one of the standards, and they just know to do it. So that's where we've seen a lot of our growth. But we don't require the even infrastructure or even EV chargers other than the multifamily. So we haven't seen the growth that Jacqueline has shown in St. Louis Park. It's only in the multifamily that we see that growth. So those are kind of the points I wanted to highlight.
Thank you. And Mike, when did you say that Bloomington adopted this?
I'm looking at it right now. It looks like December 2nd, 2019. So about a year and a half ago.
Very nice. Thank you. All right. So Lauren, I'll pull up your slides next.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Jensen, the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Rochester. And I have just a few slides here to kind of go over the background that Rochester has gone through in the last couple of years. So you can go ahead to the next one there. Really just what we've done to date. We've done a lot of kind of fact finding and researching to really set ourselves up for taking some action now here in 2021. So next slide. Some of those things have involved an EV fleet analysis, installing different charging stations, and some public parking ramps downtown, signing on to cohorts like Recharge Minnesota to develop an action plan, participating in groups like we are here today to just continue that sharing and those best learning and those best practices. And then our Energy Commission really helping to lead the charge on our energy action plan and the transportation priorities outlined there. You can go ahead to the next slide. So just a little bit of background on this. We did this EV feasibility assessment back in late 2019. This was kind of our first dive into, how can we start to make this transition to EV adoption in our community? And this just looked at specifically our fleet vehicles. So the results were 6 different vehicle candidates for replacement and 5 for optimization. Next slide. And the recommendations really that came out of that were to prioritize electric vehicle purchases due to the pandemic that got pushed back a year, continue to evaluate that optimization, identify other vehicles, and and then develop the budgetary estimates to complete those fleet and infrastructure needs. In our city facilities over the past few years, we've installed charging stations and quite a few of our public ramps downtown to continue to build out this adoption and make it more visible for our community. So at this point in time, we have 6 in our public parking ramps downtown. And then we recently completed construction on our new Development Services and Infrastructure Center, which is houses a few different departments for the city organization. And we have 2 public charging stations there now as well. Next slide, please. Really the biggest driver behind our EV initiatives has been our Energy Action Plan, which was adopted in 2017. That really kind of paved the way for us to take more action, especially in transportation, because that was a particular category that we had more focus or more influence and control over. So what our Energy Commission has been looking at as the community education aspect of electric vehicles, how do we continue to get this out there in front of people, developing transportation nodes and corridors, specifically calling out electric charging stations and infrastructure, as well as combining that with renewable energy for solar charging stations, and then just continuing to increase our public transit options that are available. So some of that includes, using EVs for car sharing options and exploring what that looks like to reduce just single occupancy vehicle trips. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, some of the other initiatives, we recently, this last year, pledged to be a part of Recharge Minnesota, and as a part of that, developed an action plan. So this focused on a variety of things related to EVs. So EV charging in our fleets, vendor supply chains, employee and community adoption. And it kind of just helped us start looking at where are we now, what are the goals we want to achieve, and what's our time frame for this. And then obviously, as I mentioned, participating in different cohorts to continue to learn from others. So where are we going? We're kind of really, like I said, in the beginning stages of what we could do for EV ordinances and policy. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. We are drafting a green fleet policy to make that transition and get that adopted for our city fleets. This year, we're embarking on an EV charging infrastructure roadmap and action plan. So really looking at where should we put this infrastructure as we look to this. We have funding within the Destination Medical Center to add in some additional infrastructure downtown. So what does that look like? Specifically prioritizing areas of environmental justice in our community and where new development will be happening, as well as like what's existing for our utility infrastructure. Some other strategies that we're looking at from what we've outlined with our Energy Commission is adopting an EV ready building code and streamlining permitting for EV charging stations, looking at a citywide EV ready ordinance, and then particularly a policy for charging infrastructure and any new multifamily buildings. And then as well as identifying grant opportunities. So we recently applied for the MPCA level 2 ones to get charging in for some of our fleet vehicles. So we're kind of just embarking on what drafting some of these would look like. We're in the process of updating our Unified Development Code. So how does that fit into this process? Currently, we do have standards in our TIF financing for downtown developments that asks that your project will be prioritized if you adhere to these green building standards, but we really want to make that community-wide, city-wide, not just within the TIF financing. So that's where Rochester is at.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. That was a good overview. So now we have some pre-prepared questions for you guys to respond to. So the first one is, St. Louis Park has adopted mandatory EV parking. How would your city council respond to mandating this in your city to the extent that St. Louis Park has?
I can start there. So I think in years past, obviously, we've had a city council that's been open to these sort of actions and strategies. Adopting our energy action plan in 2017 was a really big step. You know, really, again, wanting to understand where everything comes from, what's backing it up, especially the economic side of things when it comes to doing some of these initiatives. I think we're really fortunate that the new city council that we have as of this year is pretty progressive when it comes to sustainability initiatives in these items. So it's been exciting for us to really think about the possibility of getting some of these things done now that have really been on our list. So pursuing the opportunity for some of those policies because right now we have a city council that's pretty open to those things.
I'll say in Bloomington, we have a fairly new city council. We have a new mayor, and so it'll be interesting to see how things shift. Our sustainability commission's been working on this and since we've adopted our ordinance, but when we first approached, you know, we did a lot of study sessions with city council and our planning commission, and they weren't super excited about mandating it. I think the multifamily was kind of this compromise where we saw, well, we have some influence. It's not super impactful. It's not going to slow down development. I think that's where we see a lot of our development anyway, is in multifamily, whereas they weren't very excited about kind of retroactively requiring with parking lot path yet. And we did get some pushback with the conduit saying, well, the conduit's just going to rot out and it's not going to be useful anyway, or they're going to put it in the wrong spot and regret it 10 years down the line. And, you know, you try and explain, well, no, it's not. This is kind of standard practice, and it's forcing them to think about it. But there was that pushback, but I think it's slowly changing. And I think especially as we see more chargers out there, I think it's gonna be a lot more easier pretty soon to start mandating it and be part of our code, especially now that we see with our residential, it's just par for the course now. Even if we didn't have that standard, we still would get chargers. We still had some before that, so.
Yeah, that is true. Once more cities adopt, it'll be easier for those city councils that maybe are more resistant to see it as a norm. So the second question is, St. Louis Park has adopted a very aggressive climate action plan that supports their action on EV and EV charging infrastructure. What has enabled your city to take action?
Well, for us, really, it was in 2017 when we adopted our energy action plan. That was kind of our first step in committing to achieving these aggressive climate goals for our community and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So, you know, a big part of that I mentioned was transportation. That's something that we as a city had more control and influence over. So looking at how EVs fit into that has been a really big piece of it. We've taken that a step further this last year, and now we're developing a sustainability and resiliency action plan for our community. And with that, we're really involving the community. So what does it look like from the communities and the residents' lived experience, and what do they envision for the future of Rochester? So really tying in that social equity piece and kind of getting that community trust and buy into the process. So we're just building off of those goals we already established, and one, trying to be more aggressive with some of these strategies we're outlining, but two, just again, to build out the social equity piece of it.
And our city wasn't, this didn't come out of a climate action plan like St. Louis Park did. I think that would have been helpful when you can point to this policy document saying, this is our goal, this is why we're doing this. I think it was one of those kind of things that had been discussed over the years, and finally it made it onto our work plan to actually get done. But since then, our Sustainability Commission, which was very new at the time, now it's 3 years old, 4 years old, they're doing their climate action plan. They're working on these strategies, and I think they're working on building energy. And so I think this is going to be one of those things that get brought up again and again. And our goal was just to get something on paper, so that way we can increase it as needed as, you know, taste develops and as we see, and we can point to more and more ownership and different things that we can at least get something started so we can build off of there. And some of their ratios, like the 5% of parking, you know, we're just kind of throwing out there. We didn't have a strong basis. We've heard the 2%, which is where the 1 to 50 units came in for our multifamily. But I think it would have been helped. I think in recent developments with our sustainability commission and our sustainability coordinator doing lots of work, I think we're going to have a lot more support to do this. But it would have been nice to have that upfront a couple of years ago.
Yes. Okay. So what enables your city to take action specifically on the EV regulatory standards?
Well, for Rochester, as I mentioned, we're kind of just embarking on drafting what that looks like for our community and how it fits. I think really it just involves the buy-in and understanding from all the stakeholders involved. So we're fortunate to have that action plan to work off of, and then to have an energy commission that's charged with implementing that for our community. So their relationship with city council, as well as the newer members we have on city council this year, I think is really helping us to specifically look at some of these things now, and hopefully make some progress on adopting those for our community.
Yeah, and I think for us, it just kind of came up in discussion a lot, so it entered our work plan, and you know, our planning commission helps develop that work plan. So I think it was a couple planning commissioners that really wanted to see us do that, and I think seeing more and more examples, it's going to become more and more relevant, and so I think it's going to come up again. And we're working on our work plan this year to address our parking standards. So that's one of my projects. So I'm looking at Jacqueline going like, oh yeah, I should actually be looking at the EV as part of that too. That's in our parking standard when I start working on that later this year. And what should we update? Because that was one of the things that we talked about, was that we'll continually look at updating the numbers and the ratios and making sure that we're staying consistent or keeping up with the greater metro.
Thank you. Yes. And so who would you say would be the primary opponents and supporters in your city for adopting goals like St. Louis Park has?
I think for Rochester, we have a lot of partners already, the Energy Commission. We have good working relationships with our local utilities. We now have the Sustainability and Resiliency Task Force that we've put together to kind of drive initiatives and really bring the community into it. So I think that really helps to kind of build our supporting group of it. I think opponents just comes down to more of the development community and what this looks like and the changes that would be made for them. Again, we're pretty fortunate that we've had some developers and some new buildings in Rochester kind of take the lead on some of those things and just start to put these in because they want to have a sustainable green building and achieve some of these things and help our city reach the goals. So there are a few examples that are being set, which is helping, but just really getting, you know, the developers and planning commission like that on board.
Yeah, similar in Bloomington, Sustainability Commission and we've just got a lot of residents who are interested in this. It's one of those topics that keeps coming up and discussed. But yeah, definitely development community. You see it in multifamily. There's not a whole lot of pushback. I think, especially on some of the bigger developers, it's just what they do nationally now, and it's just become par for the course. But I think, especially, we've got a lot of aging shopping centers that are, you know, longtime property owners that don't put a lot into their buildings, and they're not major developers, so they don't have that pushback from other cities. It's just new to them and they don't see the value in it, and it's one of those educational standpoints that it'll be tougher to kind of push. But I think part of it is just educating on the cost. When you're talking about the cost of your project, it's not a huge expense to incorporate it into a part of existing project. If you're doing it on its own, it's a little more expensive, but if you're wrapping it into another project, it's really negligible and it provides a nice benefit, and then you can really sell them on You know, you look at the big box retailers, they want to do that because it keeps people in their stores and drives them to buy more things because they're in their stores longer. So I think it's things like that that our developers aren't thinking of, but some of the tenants are thinking about. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how some of the tenants start to shift and really push for this.
Yeah, education is super important, and you know, taking advantage of those allies where you can. So we already kind of touched on this last question, but I'll ask it anyway. So what is next for your city in terms of EV ready regulations?
For Rochester, it's really this EV infrastructure planning process that we're about to embark on, and kind of mapping out really a roadmap for if we are going to implement these things, where is it going? Where does it make sense? And then with the Energy Commission, they just voted on looking at a policy for EV infrastructure in multifamily buildings. So starting to do a little bit more research and drafting the language for that, as well as our green fleet policy.
And for Bloomington, it's kind of looking at, is that multifamily ratio high enough, or should it be for a smaller amount of units that you required to do a charger? I really like the idea of requiring with TIF like Rochester does, or St. Louis Park, or your PD requirements. We don't currently have that, but that's something that we discussed. Our city really, we don't have right of way to install on our own. I mean, we're just not kind of that urban, we're very suburban. So it's really on those kind of shopping centers that are privately owned. So it'll be interesting to see how that shifts over time if we do find some support for requiring it with those. And I really like how St. Louis Park had that kind of relief valve, kind of different measures like that, that I think was a little bit, we were maybe going too fast with our planning commission for them to really understand, like, we can craft this in a way that's not going to have negative impacts. So I think bringing that discussion up again and explaining those different tools will be important. But yeah, I think from the city perspective, we're investing in our fleet, we're investing in our civic facilities where we can and put chargers in, but it'll be interesting to see how we can do that on that private regulation.
Yes, thank you so much. So those are our pre-prepared questions, and now I will open up the floor if any of the participants have anything they would like to ask. Now is the time to do it.
Rebecca, this is Brian. And I would actually like to, that first question about how the city council would respond to mandating this in your city, I'd like to ask the rest of the cities in the room how they would respond to that. Would this be a non-starter? Would it be something they'd be receptive to? I'm just kind of interested. And I know some of you have an opinion on this, so go sit in on your hands.
Crickets. I'll just jump in and say it really is how you frame it, right? I think we had a lot of different pieces that we were trying to do at once, with kind of requiring, but also just a total shift from just ignoring that this even existed in our community to actually having some standards for it. But I think you can really frame it as a way that this is not going to impact costs too much. I think when you see this, you see regulation and cost, and that is anti-development. It's just adding cost, and it's going to derail all these projects. And it's like, you're talking about a couple $1,000s, and in the grand scheme of most development, it's not an issue. So it really you have to control the conversation and how you frame it. And I really, like I said before, that St. Louis Park relief valve with the 5% and the different measures at 20 stalls or less, or don't have to do it, and kind of making it less a burden for churches and schools and those that might find that actually be impactful. But I think you have to frame it as this is how it's going to work, and this is why it's not going to hurt development.
This is Sarah with Eden Prairie, and I know one of the concerns, I think it's more staff has in bringing it forward to City Council, is kind of wondering if and when the state will update the building code. And there's some concern of not wanting to put anything in code right now that may eventually be irrelevant based off of what the state does.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective, I guess. Because the international code requirement to incorporate EV or EV readiness into the international code examples actually got stripped out. So it would have to be a separate initiative by the state of Minnesota to include something that's not in the actual international code. Which could happen, I guess, but.
Okay, well, so now it is time for our post self-assessment review. So first off, though, I would really like to give a big thank you to Jacqueline and Lauren and Mike for taking time to speak with us and enlighten us. It really is really helpful and insightful to hear from cities who have already kind of started down the path, and experience. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank people who took the self-assessment. If you took the self-assessment, just as a reminder, and you would like to get your responses, please feel free to email me and I can give you a PDF version of your responses. I think it would be a helpful tool to have in your back pocket. So feel free to email me. If you haven't taken the self-assessment yet, but you would like to, the link will remain active so you can take it whenever you want. One of the big things that I would want to stress in encouraging you to take the self-assessment is that it is really helpful to Brian and I as we are creating this potential certification program. It can help guide and point us to different point values that we might have and assign to the different actions, as well as just helps us know where cities are at in terms of being EV ready. But the biggest thing is that can be a really useful tool to you and your city to measure where you're at and guide your potential future actions. So I would just keep that in mind. So in a moment, I am going to be showing you the results from the self-assessment that you all took. We had about 12 cities respond, so thank you. And that's including the focus group who took it a little bit earlier. Also, I just want to remind you that there are 3 categories of responses. There is yes, no, and skipped. And for the majority of the skipped responses, it basically is a no, because we worked into the self-assessment a logic based on a question that would filter it out. So if you hadn't done the response, or if you hadn't done the action for the particular question, you wouldn't see the follow-up questions, and we're assuming that you wouldn't have done that. So just keep that in mind. Some of the skipped is because the question wasn't answered, but the majority of them equals a no. Okay, so the first one is that from the EV policy goals and metrics, for the first 5 categories, I just picked one question that would be representative of that category. And then for the regulation category, I picked a few more since it is the topic of today's meeting. So this first one, are EVs addressed in your city's comprehensive plan? It was about half and half, 6 yeses and 6 nos, including the 2 skipped nos. That's because those cities' comprehensive plans hadn't been updated within the last 5 years. So we would assume that EVs wouldn't be included in that. I think I really like this one because it's great to see that 6 cities are at least mentioning EVs in their comprehensive plan. It shows that EVs are really starting to become more recognized and on cities' radars, which I think is really important for adoption. This next one is from the utility engagement section. So 6 cities are in a territory where the utility offers some sort of incentives for buying EVs or installing EV charging. We were kind of earlier in the panel talking about different partners and allies that we can take advantage of, and utilities are really positive, or really powerful ally for EV adoption, because they would like to see increased electricity use from EVs. And off the top of my head right now, I can't remember the exact number of responses, but less than 6 cities said that they promoted the utilities incentives to their residents. So that's kind of an area of lost potential for encouraging EV adoption. And it's really important to take advantage of a willing resource that is already in place. So that's kind of an easy thing to do.
Can I ask you a quick question, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Did you get the impression that the 9 that skipped it, they skipped it because they weren't sure if their utility had an EV program?
For that one, I don't know. Certain questions I can tell when the skipped is because they maybe weren't sure. But that one I don't have an impression of.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so the third one came from the education and incentives category. From this one, the majority of cities do not promote or offer educational materials about the benefits of EV ownership. And 2 cities reported that they did. So engaging with your residents can be as simple as having a page on the city website, or sending out a flyer in the mail, or hosting like an educational booth at a city event. And you know what, I love the panel. I kind of planned what I was going to be talking about, and the panels and the speakers, they all touched on like how important education is. And so, because a big barrier to EV adoption is that like the general population is just uncertain or unfamiliar with EVs. So making sure that they become a common household idea or norm is super helpful, and having educational materials come from the city can play a huge role in that, normalizing EVs.
I'm going to jump in again.
Yeah, no, go for it.
And only just to say, it's actually even easier than what you said. Like, they didn't even have to have a whole page devoted to electric vehicles on their website. They can just have, if they have a sustainability or environment page, a link to want to learn more about electric vehicles, and point right to Drive Electric Minnesota, where there are a ton of resources. So there's some easy ways. We've got all kinds of, kits and social media, things, EV quizzes. There's a lot of different easy ways. We want to help you do that. And one thing we heard in Cities Charging Ahead 1.0, and especially the Southeast members that are on the phone today will remember, and Red Wing especially, when they were trying to get their charger, they had a lot of resistance. And what they kept saying is if citizens would have been at City Council talking about the benefits and how important it was to them, that they, you know, it would have been better for them in trying to get their charger for the city. And so that educating the citizens and residents, I should say, in your community is pretty important. And there's lots of, this is a way we can really help you. We have a lot of resources. So please reach out to us. We're happy to help with that.
Yes, so true, Diane. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so our next one is from the public sector leadership. Does your city have EVs in their fleet? And just 3 cities reported having EVs. So this really ties into the idea of getting EVs to become a common household idea and norm. By having your fleet electrified, it increases EV visibility in your community, and also that it will increase the confidence of your residents. Maybe when they're looking to buy a new car, they might consider an EV, you know, with the thought like, oh, it works for the city, it can work for us. All right, and then the last category before we move on to the regulation category is shared mobility. So only 1 city reported using EVs for public transportation. And this one is a little more difficult, I will say, because not all cities have the ability or the power to in their public transportation. But making sure that we focus on public transportation is really important in terms of being equitable in our electrification efforts. It's so much easier to build equity in from the start than having to go back and kind of fit it in somehow. So keeping public transportation in the forefront of our minds as we move forward with fleet electrification, or with electrification, is essential. All right, so now we are on to the regulation category questions. So only 1 city's zoning ordinance or parking standards referred to EVs or their charging equipment. And this one has a very heavy no response with 10 no's. EV, you know, give me one moment. Sorry about that. There's a lot of noise in the background. So by not having EVs referenced in our zoning ordinances, we miss out on a lot of opportunities, like we heard from our speakers and from the panelists. And it also makes us miss out on opportunities such as maybe regulating who can park in the EV charging stalls. So in this one, most people, this one is one of those ones, Diana, where I can tell that a lot of them were not answered. They were skipped over, but we did have 1 no and 0 yeses for if EV charging access is protected. So moving on to the next one. So this one is asking about if cities' parking standards require some sort of stall to be EV ready, or having those conduits ready to go without having the actual charging station installed. And this, as our panelists talked about, having EV ordinances in our, well, having EV ordinances kind of allows us or forces us to be prepared for the future. And it is so much easier and a money saver to kind of have this pre-prepared, ready to go. And so even if we can't put in EV chargers now, thinking about it and having the potential for it in the future is really helpful. And as we can see, once again, we have that really heavy no, 10 cities aren't requiring this of new parking lots. And this one is my last slide that I have for the regulation, so I'll stop boring you with all these different graphs. But this one, once again, I just really wanted to highlight that the focus on equity that we can have and requiring EV ready and EV parking stalls in multifamily housing, because that, as you know, as it has been mentioned already numerous times today, having that open access to people that don't own their own houses will really increase the rate of overall EV adoption in our cities and communities. So from this, like, why am I showing you all these graphs? I guess I wanted to wrap it up with, from the results, we can see that in those first 5 categories, there were more cities who had completed the actions, but when it comes to this regulation category, we really only had like 1 or 2 cities saying that they had completed the action. So this tells us that there's a lot of room for growth, and that, you know, your city isn't alone if you haven't done these actions. And so hopefully today, with our speakers and panelists and all this information, it will help empower you to kind of start making those steps towards implementing EV and EV ready ordinances into your zoning or ordinance codes. Okay, so that's kind of our quick review of the self-assessment, and now I would like to have a discussion over it. So I would really appreciate it if we could all turn on our cameras, because I think that helps facilitate a healthy and robust discussion today. So if you can and you're able, please turn on your cameras. Thank you. Okay. All right, I'm seeing a few cameras turn on, which is wonderful. All right.
It might be easier to see each other if we put the questions in the chat, so then we can see each other's faces on the screen.
Love it. Okay. Yep. I'm going to stop my share. All right. So the first question that we have, and then while we're answering it, I'll throw the other ones in the chat. But I would like a few cities to answer, how did taking the self-assessment benefit your community?
I can speak to that question quickly. So I'm with the City of Oakdale. We do have EVs in our comprehensive plan, but are at the very initial stages of kind of incorporating them into the rest of what our city does. And I am right now in the process of completing an EV study to share with our EMC and our council a little later on. And just having the self-assessment, and in particular having the full assessment, including all the questions that I ended up skipping because of the skip logic, I was able to fill out the policy section of this study really, really quickly, which was helpful, with very tangible ideas that we would want our EMC and our planning commission to chew on before we bring the study itself to our city council. So that was a really quick, easy action step that I benefited from directly from the self-assessment.
This is Annie from St. Louis Park. I found it really helpful just internally, just to reference, and I reached out to a few staff members to get answers. So it was just really helpful for me to kind of go through it and learn more. And I really appreciate now that we do have that hard copy, and now we can kind of see, like, as we're starting to review these other standards and such, that this can then be a reference we can look at for future inspiration.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and as a reminder, so we did send out a PDF form of just the questions, but if you do take the self-assessment, email me and then I can give you one that has your answers included. Okay, so then the next question is, what are the perceived and real barriers to adopting EV regulations in your community?
I think we touched on this a little bit earlier in our discussion with Mike and I, but, just getting the buy-in from the stakeholders, the understanding from them, from community members, that kind of complete picture of it's not just an environmental thing, it's an economic thing, it's a social equity thing. There's a lot of benefits that can come from it. So I think, those are things that are perceived as barriers to people, but if we just have that understanding to create that buy-in, it helps.
This is John. I can talk a little bit about Winona, and kind of one barrier we have is the perception that the EV charging is something for the private sector to do. They're kind of in the mindset of, gas stations are privately owned, so should electric vehicle things should be the same way of some company coming in and doing it, and not having kind of a requirement from the city or anyone else.
That is kind of an interesting vision of the future where like gas stations instead are EV charging areas, which would be kind of cool maybe. So then we asked this of the panelists, but what will enable your city to take action to kind of make these changes?
I think about as I said, I'm a Green Corps member, so I don't have like pure authority, but something that has come up for me sort of is like this idea of partnerships and like doing things like as a group sort of, rather than even just like relying on one another, like looking at other cities and like what they've done and being like, look, here's an example, but like actually like a potential partnership where it's like, no, like me and like my 3 neighbor cities are all like coming, like we're all going to come at this together at the same time, sort of, so that that like if you're a resident in this area, you'll also, if you use the grocery store over in the neighboring city, that you'll also have access to a charging station there as well, because we're like kind of guaranteeing it as a block. I don't know. That's just an idea that I wanted to toss out there.
I like that. I mean, just specifically for EV, I think a lot of the fear from community members is like range and where the available charging stations are. So if you're kind of creating those partnerships where people know the next city over has one, especially in like, grocery stores or shopping malls or popular places that they might be going to, I think it further helps that community adoption side of it.
And I also think a lot of communities don't have a lot of electric vehicles registered in their city quite just yet. I know that's the case for Oakdale. And so our city council tends to think, well, if there aren't that many EVs in Oakdale, why are we even considering this in the first place? And the reality is there are a lot of EVs in the area surrounding Oakdale, and this is part of a network. So having that conversation about going into this as a block is a really innovative idea.
Go off of that, a lot of the research our Energy Commission did, because we kind of had the same thing. There's a lot of studies that other cities have done that show that if you build it, they will come. So just building out that infrastructure in your city encourages people to buy EVs. So there's a lot of good resources out there for that too.
This is Jen from City of Woodbury. One of the things that comes up when we talk about public infrastructure for EV, the question that's been brought up before, like, is that the city's place? But the other thing is, residents haven't come to us asking for this. And so unless the community is asking for it, why would we put that on developments or pay for it ourselves? We are, moving forward with things for our own fleet, but as far as the public charging, I think that's one of the biggest barriers is, until the residents are asking for it, or we see that there's a gap there, why would we spend the money to take care of it?
that's really interesting to think about in terms of like the education. So like, right, if we're educating, and the more visible that the EVs are, the more that your residents will be asking for it. And so it's kind of a balancing act, right?
Well, I think another thing is that, you know, when you look at how many EVs are in Woodbury, I don't know what the number is right now, but there's a decent number. And that, you know, the other thing that's been brought up is they're charging at home, you know, so the people that need the chargers aren't necessarily the Woodbury residents. So we wouldn't necessarily hear that.
Very true. Okay, I'll throw out the last discussion question that we have. So what is next for you and your city in terms of EV ready regulation? Maybe if we hear from some cities that haven't spoken yet, that would be great. Because, you know, it's right, we're all in the same boat. We're all we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and hearing from other cities and what they're doing is really helpful and informative.
Yeah, I think, Rebecca, you should threaten to start calling out names unless people volunteer. So.
Okay, I might have to volunteer some people. How about John? We'll start with you. You're in my top corner.
Yeah, well, I think for Winona, we are redoing doing an update of our comp plan in the next year or so, and so that is going to be our chance to really, I think, make the case for the need for, you know, EV ready policies. So I think we're kind of waiting till then. We are working on a sustainability plan that's going to promote, you know, get that ball rolling too. But it's probably the comp plan where a lot of that policy change is going to happen. And by that time, there will be a lot of other cities who have a lot of great stuff going, and we can just, you know, learn from them.
That's awesome. How about David? What is your city up to?
Sure. So in Faribault, we've had discussions on this quite a bit, and I think over the coming year, we'll have a lot more discussion on it. I have a very long list of to-do things, and I'm not sure exactly where this is going to get, but based on the discussion that others have had, totally agree that the importance of awareness and understanding and really getting buy-in from the council as we move forward is going to be really important. Right now, what we do a lot of is having discussions. So basically every project that comes in, especially if it's multifamily and to some extent industries and other kinds of things, I've always brought up the importance of being able to have the electric vehicle charging stations. And we have been able to get some of that just by having that discussion up front. And I think probably politically, we are going to be in a point where we could get to a regulation as it relates to particularly to multifamily housing, where there's a lot of public assistance to get a lot of this done, where we can then tie that to the public assistance. And then I think it's going to take a little while longer to get to some of the other aspects without, again, having more detailed discussions. So I see this evolving over a period of time here.
Thank you. Yeah. And Diana, how are you feeling on time for your Q&A? Do we have a bit more time for discussion or? Okay. All right. So are there any other cities then that want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll call out some names. Maybe Jen, do you have anything to add?
I'm sorry, I got distracted for a second. What was the question?
Yeah, no. So what is your city doing next in terms of EV ready regulations?
Oh, okay. So EV ready, we aren't, we're doing a lot more just towards our fleet right now. And we're hopefully working with Excel to upgrade the infrastructure associated with City Hall so that we can get more chargers in there. As far as the public, I think we're having a lot of conversations right now about developing a climate action plan. And hopefully through that, we would also do partners in energy and, you know, have that community engagement piece. And so I think that that will help us move to the next level.
Perfect, thank you. How about Drew from Minnetonka? Are you on to answer what's next for your city?
Yeah, I'm on. I'm having some difficulty with video, so I'll be a blank screen here. Yeah, we haven't done a whole lot with EVs. We've generally allowed them in all of our different districts, but we haven't put anything specific on our code, so that's something probably to look into next. But as far as pushing things, we haven't really made a plan or anything. We have a lot of other irons in the fire right now, so that'll probably be something we'll have to look to a little bit farther down the line.
How about Allie? Are you on? Allie Sutherland?
Yeah, kind of similar to Jen. So we just went through the first phase of the Partners in Energy process at the City of Inver Grove Heights. Our city council just approved our energy action plan. So now we're moving into phase 2 of implementation at the beginning of next month. And that's, I think that our plan is mostly guided to outreach, but we did include, and that would be to residents and businesses, but we did include some action items for municipal actions as well, including our fleet and just, you know, revising our policies. So, you know, I think that updating it in terms of EV readiness for just the code and our own fleet will be a part of that whole process. So at the very beginning stages, but excited to see where this can fit in. And we do have language in that plan on electric vehicles. So probably our first reference in terms of like official city documents, which is good. It's a good start.
That's exciting. Annie, would you like to go ahead and share?
Sure. I think Jacqueline could probably speak to more of the technical aspects. I know she had kind of said in her presentation we're going to be looking at some upcoming changes to ordinances and kind of adjusting it as technology moves forward. Something that's not as technical, I guess, but I noted when Brian was speaking earlier is just looking at the potential of multifamily housing right-of-way charging. That's something Emily and I, our sustainability manager, have looked at. And it's more from a city level, like when we're rolling out more public stations, what it would mean to put them in the right of way and just make them more accessible, and considering a lot of things around that. So I'm really excited for that possibility, just thinking about, again, what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, adding on that, Annie, I think we might be looking at bumping up our level 2 requirements just a little bit, because level 1 charging, unless you're at home, it doesn't cut it anymore. We might be tweaking some of our location requirements as far as requiring EV chargers right next to the front door. I don't know if that's something we really want to push as much as we have in the past, particularly that's like the one thing that's kind of a barrier. And then Annie mentioned, but getting charging in right away will be really, really impactful, I think. We just got to figure out how to do it.
Yes, well, I'd love to hear what every city is doing, but I will turn it over to Diana now for the last segment.
All right, thank you. That was a really good conversation. And thank you to all that took the self-assessment. It's really helpful to us as we continue to figure out how we can support cities in their EV journey and improve this program as we try to figure out ways to fund it to really make a program out of it that people can get certified. And so very excited to have this conversation today. And the last part is just general questions and answers. I'm guessing that we've covered a lot of that during the different question and answer periods. I'm not sure that there's a lot more, but you know, we are open to that. And as I said last time, I will just say that this is technically the last meeting of the city's Charging Ahead 2.0 cohort. But I went rogue and decided that there was some potential for folks that missed things, or especially if there's other city staff at your cities that you feel like could really use kind of the highlight reel, if you will, from the full cohort. I've been working on putting together an agenda, and I haven't decided if it's going to be April 14th or April 29th, but one of those 2 days will be something called EV boot camp for cities, or something that is a much more truncated version of kind of covering the topics that we covered in this full cohorts in September: charging, fleet, and EV readiness, and kind of hitting the highlights. It won't be a lot. It won't be guest speakers like we've had, because we just can't pack that into 2 hours. But hitting the highlights, and then the resources, and then having small breakouts after each of those sections for cities to be able to talk to each other about their experience, so you still get that peer-to-peer piece, because that's been an important part of what we've done here. So I'm working on putting that together, and I'll send we'll send an email out to you to let you know when it is, and be thinking about other city staff members or commission members or electeds. I mean, it's really open to folks that will, be interested in kind of learning a little bit more. Again, we won't go as deep, but we'll hit the highlights and show the resources, and have, some opportunity for conversation with some cities. And so that means I will ask some of you cities that have been so good and are further down the path of EV readiness to be on the meeting, so that when we have those small breakouts, there's some cities that had some experience to share that would be really helpful to us and to them. And in addition, folks that are Green Step cities, out of the annual survey, there were a number of cities that they were interested in EVs and wanted assistance. So this will be a chance for me to invite those cities who have not been a core part of CCA to be part of this. So again, for folks that miss pieces, other city staff, commission members, be thinking about that, please, because I hope that folks will really be interested in joining and hearing more about it and the resources that we have to help. So that will be happening in April, and like I said, I'm not sure which date. I just have to make a decision, but we'll let you know. We'll get it out to you. Any questions? I know we're at noon here, but I know that we've called on you and we've got a question and answer. I hope this was helpful. And again, as usual, there will be a survey. It'll probably go out later next week about these 2 EV readiness sessions. And then there will be a final survey that will go out probably in a couple of weeks for the full cohort. And we'll be asking some information that we've asked in the past. And part of it is to really help our resources. And we've been putting together one of the things I get asked most about is what are other cities doing? And so which cities have vehicles in their fleet, which have chargers, are they charging for them? So I'll be asking some information, and we're trying to put together a database so that you all can search for which cities have these things and contact them directly versus contacting me and asking me which cities do this or that. So it'll be a little bit deeper survey, but yeah, so that's the plan. That's how we learn, and that's how I get information to really be able to help you all, because you guys email me all the time and say, what cities are doing this? I'm like, I don't know. I'll have to think about that and look at my emails. So it'll be really helpful. Any thoughts, any questions? Oh, great. Jennifer has staff in mind that she wants to invite to the highlights reel. I don't think we're going to call it the highlights reel, but I like that a little bit. EV boot camp, I think is what we're calling it. EV boot camp for municipals or something. I don't know. Awesome. Well, thank you, all of you, especially those that have presented, had took the self-assessment. We really appreciate it. You're helping each other. As you know, cities, you like to look at the St. Louis parks and the others that have gone before, Woodbury on fleets and fleet vehicles, and it helps you. So we appreciate you taking the time to share with each other, and it's been really awesome. And just because you might have been at all the meetings, if you want to come to the highlight reel, you can certainly come to the highlight reel. you will be welcome. All right. Thanks, everyone. Happy Thursday.
Thank you.